what do we want to do when we're describing somebody or something we've lost that's important? Do we want to have a true picture, as in, a factual story? Someone could check all the facts and that's all perfect and that's done. Or do we want to create something that is a version, which is a version that hasn't been told about them? And isn't that equally valid? A death is always an intense time if you love somebody. I had 2 deaths which came within 5 months of one another, and they were very isolating experiences. I do feel that I have gained a lot by focusing on the things I didn't see. So I'm particularly interested, you say, what inspires my stories? I'm interested in the things that are under the surface.
Hello, I'd like to introduce AT Boyle, or Alison as I call her. AT Boyle created X Objects after the death of her parents in the COVID years. The web magazine and book use objects to address loss through creative reflections in writing and visual art. The first collection of S Object stories was published in India at the end of December 2024, and Alison is planning to launch an X Objects podcast in 2026. Alison has worked as an editor and publisher in London, Bath, and Oxford, and is multiply published as an author in magazine and book formats. She runs international arts collaborations through her organization artificialsilk.org, a name inspired by her Lancashire family's background in weaving and the pigmentation of rayon, which of course is artificial silk. The current collaboration is with the Book Festival in Staffordshire, where writers were commissioned to reflect on an object and memories associated with sound called Writing That Sings. My connection with Alison began when she asked me to write a piece for the Writers That Sing project, reflecting on a poem, an autumn tullal, that my father wrote in London in 1951. An autumn tullal is a recite and dance art form of Kerala, raising prevalent social political questions and making a satire of human pedigrees and prejudices. My father used this approach in his autumn tullal when describing Londoners of 1951. But more on that later. Alison, as you know, my podcast Stories Seldom Told explores how personal narrative shape our judgment and beliefs. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, your stories. What is it that's influenced you and shaped you in your judgments and beliefs? When I introduced you, for example, you said that you created X Objects after the death of your parents. Perhaps you can take us back to those pandemic years?
Yes, that was a very different time, wasn't it? And I'm glad it's very different because we really have moved on. At the same time, some people have moved on less because of the pain of that time. And some people obviously have long COVID, and that's a physical reminder of that time. There were regrets for a lot of people, and sometimes from regret and loss, very positive things come because it was a very intense time. A death is always an intense time if you love somebody. I had 2 deaths which came within 5 months of one another, and they were very isolating experiences. And of course, death is a separation, but the circumstances, having to wear a mask if you're with somebody at their bedside, or not being able to get to their bedside in time because you're not actually allowed in there, these make the separation harder. But I do think that imaginative stories can come from those intense periods. And I do feel that I have gained a lot by focusing on the things I didn't see. So I'm particularly interested, you say, what inspires my stories? I'm interested in the things that are under the surface when we're living, what is happening in that person's life. They may not want to vocalize, but you do get a sense of who they are. And what I've done with the X Objects, starting with my mum, who died first, I began reflecting the moment I heard from the hospital that she died, and the family got there within a minute too late. I wasn't one of those people because I wasn't able to get there in time. They were nearer, they still couldn't get there. But luckily, I had seen my mum in the hospital before that. And the last thing she'd said to me in person was, "I love you." And I knew that she did. But there were times, parent and child, we didn't have that close relationship as, sister, which perhaps now is more possible. It depends on the personalities. But what was important about it was that I began to write immediately. I had that news. I just got on my typewriter, or rather my iPad keyboard, and I wrote all my thoughts as a flow. Then I wrote a eulogy for her at the funeral. And then I wrote an obituary, which was published in The Guardian in Other Lives.
I just want to pause there because you've given us a lot of information, and I want to kind of to sit with that just for a minute. So you firstly you talk about the pandemic and the fact that all of us who experience a pandemic anywhere in the world, but we're talking specifically in the United Kingdom, where, of course, there were a certain set of rules where you were not allowed to go and see loved ones. And so your mother was ill, was dying, and you explained that you did manage to go and see your mother, but just when she was dying and subsequently passed away, you did not make it just before she went. But in amongst that, you said many other things, and I want to just pick up on that one sentence, which you said much earlier on, which is about in a relationship, and correct me if I'm wrong, you say that you realize with the benefit of hindsight that there are things we do not see. So what does that actually mean to you? I'm trying to understand that even before you tell us about the obituary you wrote for The Guardian and so on. What does things you do not see mean to you in relation to your relationship of loss and death?
Yeah, the things we don't see make up that holistic picture of who someone is and their relationship to us. And it connects very closely to X objects, which I've always been interested in, objects as a nexus to many, many things, drawing together the intersection through time, through people, could be places, communities. I've always thought about that because I have always been a visual art person as well as a writer. I've always, when I've created books, I always start with a doodle, a pencil, piece of paper, and if it's a story, I'll think of a title because that is the beginning for me. Those beginning words and that beginning visual. I imagine quite a lot of things, worlds that I can then describe. So as far as a person is concerned, the lives that we live sometimes, we may not be saying those things, but we are aware of those connections. When someone's taken away from you and it's a dramatic thing, maybe that's the only time that we can really talk about the things that weren't articulated by them, because we have the freedom to do that. They're not there to tell you that's not exactly what I thought. And I think there's space to use our imaginations. If we don't know something, we don't know a lot of things about other people. If we don't know it, then we can write it. No one's going to tell us off. And we can actually probably flourish in the way we write about them. We can flesh out that person. Maybe they were quite modest, as my mum was. Maybe they were show-offs, as my dad was. But my dad was also very private, and people have always got private parts of them. And I have been always very fascinated about what is the necessary component to write something that's compelling about somebody. And I do think maybe that we've got to have lost them, or we've got to have lost that thing. And if we
I think so.
Yeah.
I would just question that because this idea of losing, because it's and I have lost a parent, as you know. My mother is still alive, but my father died many, many years ago. Um, I have lost friends. So you and I both know, and I'm sure many of the listeners will also know and understand what it feels like in losing somebody who they love. So, are you suggesting that it is only after death of that person that we are able to see the things we cannot see? I'm just pulling up that beautiful structure of sentence again. Is that what you mean?
Yes, I do, because I attempted, while taking my parents, there are other people, as you say, who are important in your life. I explored this idea of living eulogies. How do we celebrate somebody who's alive while they're alive? What do we say, when they're within the hearing distance or reading distance of what you want to say? And if they're important to you, there are many positive, wonderful things you can say about them. It's perhaps harder to be negative about them because obviously, everybody's got their flaws. On the other hand, talking of that, filling in the gaps, what do we want to do when we're describing somebody or something we've lost that's important? Do we want to have a true picture, as in, a factual story? Someone could check all the facts and that's all perfect and that's done. Or do we want to create something that is a version, which is a version that hasn't been told about them? And isn't that equally valid? Because we don't need to tell, lies about them, but we can hide things from the general public because actually there are things that we want to protect. And we also may not want to be really negative about some, particular trait. Why say it? Give it in a line, and then talk about the wonderful, joyous, amazing things that you can openly celebrate. Because that is the very important thing for me, that we have the loss, but by looking really closely, really trying hard, even for something that's quite, a difficult incident in someone's life, we can actually find reasons why somebody acted in that way, perhaps, and see behind their behavior.
Mm. Because I think we all of us um, create our own reality. And the idea of truth, as you said, what is true and what is untrue. And of course, if we are writing about somebody or something that we love, we will write what we perceive as true. And that is not necessarily wrong. But tell me a little bit more, Alison. I'd like to understand a little bit more about this idea of what you mean by ex-object. So, you, if you want to just go back again to the pandemic, your mother died. The last time you met her, she told you, "I love you." She said that to you, and you will always hold that to your heart for the rest of your life, which is very, very precious. What about your father? Because you said also earlier on that you lost both your parents during the pandemic, 5 months apart. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so, what does that then do to you? And in your story, your narrative, what, how it, let's call it now 2018 or any year you want. And there is AT Boyle in 2018. And then fast forward to 2021, where you have lost both your parents over a period of 5 months. How different is the 2018 or whichever year you want to choose AT Boyle as opposed to the AT Boyle of 2021, 2022?
Yeah, it's a question of scale, I would say. So they led quite private lives in many ways. And the things in their house, some of the things were private, the objects I then discovered when they died. And I would say it's a question of exploding some of those things. So we had a pandemic is a massive thing. I moved from that very private world to making judgments in my writing and actually paintings. I started to paint. I painted my first oil painting representing my mom. I haven't said this. So I worked on it, bought some oil paints, bought a canvas, and created an image over a period of about 6 months, which represents the feelings that I had. It's a very fragmented
And
image.
are you saying you had not painted before that?
Yeah, I painted watercolors all my life.
You have, okay.
I've never worked with oils at all, but
Mhm.
interesting thing was working in a different medium was good. It was alien, like everything else. It felt very alien. I worked out a technique,
So
but it,
you were embracing something that was foreign to you in
yeah,
your grief.
yes, the writing and the visual art. The visual art was a different form. The writing felt familiar, but I hadn't ever written memoir, so I suppose they were all different. There were lots of things new to write about. And it was very meditative doing both those things. I worked every single day on that painting. I worked on a little part of it. I worked and I did another bit. I would say then when my dad died, I did the same thing. I wrote an obituary for him, which was published in The Guardian as well. There they are. He's in the theatre section, she's in the science section, because that relates to where they met in the laboratory. And as you say, that industry of artificial silk or rayon. I started a painting for him, and his painting is more fluid in its shapes, and that relates to all the processes in the factory where this viscosity, the materials are an engendering of a liquid form into hard filaments which are woven. It's an amazing alchemy.
Can I, perhaps it's wrong, but I'm reading more to that idea of viscosity and fluidity and so on in a painting. And I'm wondering whether because perhaps your relationship between your mother, obviously we all have different relationships with each of our parents. My relationship with my father is different to my relationship with my mother, as I'm sure it is with you. And so would you say it's your connection and your relationship with each of your parents that influenced you in the way you did each of the paintings?
They were an influence. I would say that the reason that I used more, I would say maybe sharp edges and fragmented, almost like a sort of smashed stained glass window maybe, for my mum was because she was very much a quiet matriarch, very supportive, amazing person, always looking to people in the family, always supported. And although she was old, it was a shock that she died first. When my dad died, he already had double dementia. He was an amazing communicator all his life. He still could communicate, as the medical people said, amazingly in spite of this. But we knew that he was ill. So I think I had already acclimatized a little bit to that. And also the devastation of my mum dying was, I think, brutal.
Mm.
And that was partly how that, engendered on the canvas. That was an influence. But they were very different personalities, yeah.
But also I realize now, because you've given us a little bit more context about how each of them died, in some ways you had already said goodbye to your father when the dementia started. And therefore, at the time of his actual death, it was just a final goodbye. Whereas with mother, as you just said, it was much more painful and much more brutal. And therefore, your reactions and your visceral responses to both will be quite different. I understand that. But I want to just explore a little bit more, Alison, and thank you for sharing your very, honest, traumatic, moving experience of losing both parents 5 months apart. Not many people would have that. Many people, I'm sure you and I know, who have lost both their parents, but not necessarily 5 months apart. And that suddenly, whatever age you are, kind of takes the rug from under your feet. You could be 75, and even then, oh my, I no longer have a parent. There is this anchor that we just know keeps us grounded. And suddenly that anchor is gone forever. So I'm just wondering a little bit more about how you felt, because you certainly said to us that from, say, the metaphorical year of 2017 to 2022, you embraced new ideas, for example, oil painting and writing, larger memoir kind of writing rather than short essays. But what about you as a human being? Your personality? Tell us a little bit about you. And do you think, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you think that the loss of both parents over a short period of time has changed you fundamentally from who you were 5 years earlier than that?
It definitely has affected me, but I would say that what hasn't changed is that I have always espoused the importance of creative expression, and my subject matter has changed, but I haven't changed my interest in bringing the imagination to the work. So rather than starting with an imaginative world, there, some of these things are objects, they exist, although they could be intangible objects. But what I think my parents gave me, which I'm very grateful for, is that solidity and a feeling that you crack on, you make the best of things. There were wartime parents. So I'll give you one example of how I reacted to it. So alongside doing my writing, I did some longer pieces. The first one I wrote was called Peace, and that is because I found at the top of their wardrobe a tiny, tiny, delicate icing sugar dove, which was on top of their wedding cake. Absolutely perfectly preserved, tiny.
How long were they married?
Nearly 70 years.
So this was lying there on top of the wardrobe for nearly 70 years.
It was in a little bag of wedding things. Interestingly, I love this. When I've looked at the wedding photographs, I can't find a little dove. I can find all the other bits, like the, naff, shiny silver horseshoes on ribbons that people here would put on their wedding cake. Can't find the little dove. Could be the photographer didn't have the right angle, but it does exist, and it was in that bag. And it is the sort of thing that would go on. Anyway, I wrote a piece about it as an object. Also, it drew me very closely to her being present in the room as I discovered it. And they were very much people to celebrate birthdays. So my mum had a birthday, she'd be 88, 89 in the pandemic. And I went with my daughter, we took birthday cake, we took all kinds of things, and I write about the humor, this sort of silly slapdash things that happen when you are forced to have a birthday celebration in a little room separated by double glazed windows while your parents sit in the kitchen and like really thick, efficient double glazed windows where you can't hear them very well and they were slightly deaf. And there we were making jumped up from behind the cupboard with the birthday candles. And then we're saying, how are you going to blow the candles out? We've got the candles on this side. And then sort of slightly opening the door and putting our hand in so we're not infecting each other.
You've got to laugh because otherwise you'll cry hearing the story.
And we had all these things that we'd taken, different food for them to keep going during the pandemic, and all these balloons and different things. And they all kind of fell all over us, it was just chaos in our little extension. But that was, I tried to write it humorously, in the book Ex Objects. That's one of the stories that I write is right at the beginning of my section with her amazing cake. She was really good at chocolate cake, and I tried to replicate the chocolate cake. I would never be as good as her doing it. And I write in the story, when we've passed the little slices through the door, I intensely watch my mum's face so she takes the first bite to see what she thinks of it, because she's going to be critically analysing whether it's that ganache is quite like.
Did she approve?
She said it was good, yes, but I could tell a little, it wasn't quite perfect, but that's fine because she was a very honest person, and I loved whatever we were gaining. We're talking about this proximity, what we don't say, what we can't hear. There was so much connection through signs, not saying something, looking. That's the important thing for me about Ex Objects. We don't even need to have the object, but if we look closely, we try to find the joy, we try to find some truths about ourselves and other people. We'll have moved on in some way. And, Ex Objects was never about being a grief memoir. It's very important to speak our grief and we have to live it. But this particular project is very much where is the joy.
That's beautiful. But I want to come back to ex objects, and what you have done with it and what you are doing with it. So tell us a little bit more about this project that you started so that the listeners can appreciate and understand. I mean, it started because you lost both your parents over a period of 5 months, and that grief, um, which in itself is so very powerful, Alison, helped you focus on being even more creative than you were. That's how I see it from where I'm sitting. You always painted, you always wrote. Suddenly, you were pushing yourself, you were challenging yourself in ways that you didn't know you had within you. Because oil painting is a completely different, for those who paint, I don't, but from what I know, it's a very different and quite difficult way of painting if you're used to doing watercolors. Equally, writing an essay of 3,000 words as opposed to writing a memoir of X number of pages, again, completely different and much more challenging. So, can you expand a little bit more about your idea of X subjects and how are you seeing it grow? What is the future of this for you?
I realised quite early on that there were great benefits in doing what I was doing for myself. And I don't claim that there will be equal benefits or interest for everybody, but I did feel very strongly, and talking to my family, my lovely close family, that this was something I could share with other people, put it out there. And we had walked around the block, where I was sometimes just bursting into tears, where the grief would just overwhelm me. And then we'd say, no, let's do something bigger than this. Write about your things, express it, but other people are going through the same thing. So that's what I did. I put on my website, artificialsilk.org, my early piece called Peace with a Dove, and some other writing, and invited other people to contribute their thoughts using an object as a starting point. And I made some wonderful connections with some young Indian people through a British Council India scholar that I'd got to know. And through that network, invited lots of people in India particularly, which is the main country that I work with in my project collaborations. And they sent in quite short pieces, just a few hundred words. The young people particularly struck me in India as seeing their lives with their grandparents, these generally very beautiful old houses with a yard, particular trees, the scents, the kind of cooking, the ambience of going to see them was a very precious part of their lives, and quite a lot of them felt that they had lost it. So some of them wrote about that, and they wrote honestly. And those pieces are on the website now with the object photograph. And so there's an open invitation, if listeners want to contribute their own piece, what will happen is that I will work directly with them as an editor, and we won't publish anything when it's not ready, but we will publish it and celebrate it if they want to do that. It could be that they want to keep it private and it's just a process for them, or maybe in the future they want other people to read it. So that's where it went, and from there I've worked with some of those young people in a different way. I've helped them to build some of their editing and writing skills. And we obviously have the book that you mentioned, which was brought out in India at the end of last year.
And you're also hoping a podcast next year.
Yes, want very much to start that, because I think this kind of conversation is something quite different. You have the writing, you have the object, which is a visual item, but there's something very important in the conversation. And we do have conversations in writing, don't we? We have an exchange of emails and we have that kind of thing. But something about I'll tell you something that was brilliant about the end of my mum and dad's life was digital technology. So I was able, in spite of the very difficult connectivity sometimes in hospital, I was able 3 times to connect my mum with my dad. So my mum had been taken into hospital, my dad we were caring for at home, and she was about to come back home. She caught COVID in hospital. She didn't have it when she went in. She caught it there. She was getting over it, and then she suddenly died. But before then, I had managed to connect, and so there we were. As I'm speaking to you now, we saw her in hospital. My mum and dad were able to directly talk to one another. For my dad with dementia, it was really important to be able to see her. And I've used it a lot to be able to build these India-UK connections, these creative interchanges.
That's lovely. But so certainly the listeners and I have understood and appreciated X objects, and of course, as you said, it's an open invitation. If anybody wants to contact you, they can check out artificialsilk.org, and they have all the details, and they can reach out to you. But let's imagine, I'd like you to give us one piece of advice, not necessarily about X objects or about any of the work that you're doing, because not everybody can be like you. But what happens when there is extreme unexpected trauma, when you are losing two people that you love, when the rug is pulled from under your feet, when that foundation stone of having both parents is gone, or whatever the trauma might be in your life? Is there anything that you can tell us that perhaps we can hang on to help ourselves when we are suddenly, metaphorically slapped in the face, or something happens unexpectedly to us? Anything that we can learn from your experience?
In my experience, I would always make in whatever way feels comfortable to you, or pitch into that risk area and try making something in the way, like you mentioned, the oil paintings for me, although I always have been interested in, working in those areas, but find something different maybe, but be expressive if you can be, because in the making and the doing, you will be taken to, and you'll be taking yourself to different places. And I think that sense of volition helps. It gives you structure. You're not able to control every minute of the day. You're not able to, have a trajectory that is going to be even in dealing with that loss. But there is I think, very strongly an opportunity there to feel as though you are learning something new, being in control. And for me, that actual physical making, even if you're not going to show it to anybody else. And obviously the other part of it is that the kind of connections you make through art and through creative expression can also be enabled through conversation. So if you're able to open up with people about it, you again don't need to say everything. Some of these things are private, but even if it's not a doleful conversation, but it's something that is completely out of your comfort area, just a time when you might speak to somebody you trust about something that is almost forced, it's enjoyable, it feels alien perhaps, but you may be able to pick little tendrils from it which will give you strength and energy to move through.
Thank you. That's a good pause for thought, really. That when we do, and make, if you can't paint and you can't draw and you can't write, you can make something else. We can all be creative within ourselves, and that's what you're saying. Just use whatever skill you have, focus, and create parameters, and that will give you a sense of control when everything else upon you, around you, you're falling apart. But it is there, you have a focus, even if it's for 1 hour a day, you've got that focus, you're doing something. And because you're making, you can see the creative result from it. That's excellent. AT Boyle, thank you so very much for sharing your story, Seldom Told.
Thank you. I've very much enjoyed it, Smita, and obviously I've gained a lot by listening to your podcast and all the people that you have met around the world, which is, very inspiring and gives me that sort of global context, which I think is another way, although our circumstances might feel quite narrow when we have these blows, actually there are many things out there if we just look.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in. This episode was edited by Alina Kazmi with production support from the 180 DC JMI team. The best praise is sharing, as you all know, so if you've enjoyed today's episode, please share. And of course, thank you for listening. I am Smitha Tharoor, and this is Stories Seldom Told.